Cop attacks Canadian guy in the airport. Instant karma ensues. Before we proceed, please hit the subscribe button and let us know your location in the comments below. Sergeant Alex Porter had been wearing his badge proudly for the past 20 years. Throughout his career, he had encountered everything from armed heists and high-speed pursuits to intense hostage situations. Now, at the age of 47, Alex had transitioned away from the adrenaline-fueled chases on the streets. For the last 5 years, he had been overseeing security at Pearson International Airport, a role he considered a dignified yet somewhat routine capstone to his law enforcement career. This role, while less hazardous, demanded constant vigilance. Airports attract all kinds of illicit activities, from drug smuggling to human trafficking, and it was Alex's duty to prevent these criminals from slipping through unnoticed. The day began as usual with passengers streaming through the terminal, their arms burdened with hefty suitcases and hands gripping passports wearily. The intercom system continuously announced boarding calls and final reminders, creating a perpetual background noise. Over his black coffee, Alex watched the crowd closely. Years on the job had honed his instincts to near supernatural accuracy. At least, that's what he believed. He could often pinpoint a potential troublemaker by their hesitation at security checks or their avoidance of eye contact. That particular day, he was on the lookout for a fugitive. Early in the morning, Alex had been alerted about a wanted individual, suspected of financial fraud and considered dangerous, who might attempt to flee overseas. The notification included a blurry photo of an ordinary-looking man with glasses, medium build, and short brown hair. Despite the vague details, Alex was on high alert, ready to identify any suspect matching the description. As his shift neared its end, a man disembarked from a flight originating in Toronto, capturing Alex's immediate attention. The man was tall, slender, and wore glasses, and he carried a time-worn leather briefcase. There was a certain unease about him. He looked around the terminal apprehensively, as if he was expecting to be followed. His hands adjusted his glasses nervously, and he frequently checked his phone. Alex focused intently, suspecting this might be the fugitive. Though the physical description wasn't a perfect match, the similarities were sufficient to warrant suspicion. Alex discreetly followed the man, identified as Daniel Blake, an esteemed human rights attorney just back from a taxing week of international engagements. Daniel had spent the recent days at a UN conference in Geneva, advocating for displaced refugees. Completely worn out and dealing with jet lag, Daniel was unaware that his unremarkable appearance might soon involve him in an unexpected predicament. As Daniel neared the checkpoint for connecting flights, Alex made his move. He stepped directly in front of Daniel, his demeanor calm yet authoritative. "Sir, I need you to step aside for a random screening," Alex announced. Startled, Daniel looked up, his mild Canadian accent carrying his confusion. "Me?" "Yes, you," Alex confirmed, motioning toward a section reserved for additional screenings. Passers-by glanced their way, accustomed to the occasional disturbances typical of airport security routines. Daniel, puzzled by the unfolding events, followed Alex's instructions without objection. As the screening progressed, Alex's inquiries grew increasingly probing. "Where are you arriving from?" he asked sharply. "Geneva," Daniel responded, his tone both firm and weary. "And what was your business there?" Alex continued, eyeing him closely. "I was at a conference," Daniel replied, his brow furrowing slightly. "I'm a lawyer." Alex's suspicion intensified. The profession sounded too convenient, almost like a perfect alibi. He decided to dig deeper. "Do you have any proof of that?" he demanded. With a sigh of fatigue rather than deceit, Daniel reached into his briefcase for his itinerary. However, his momentary hesitation, though born from exhaustion, was enough for Alex to escalate the situation. "Enough," Alex commanded abruptly. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them. You're under arrest." Daniel was taken aback. Under arrest? For what? For fraud and evasion, Alex declared sharply. "We've been alerted about you. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." As the situation grew tense, onlookers began to pull out their phones, capturing the confrontation. Daniel, incredulous, protested, "This is a misunderstanding. I have no idea what you're accusing me of." But Alex was resolute, disregarding Daniel's protests. He seized Daniel's arm, forcing him to the ground. The thud of the briefcase hitting the terminal floor resonated, drawing gasps and whispers of disbelief from the surrounding crowd. As Daniel struggled, maintaining his composure, he asserted, "You're making a grave error," even as Alex restrained him more firmly. The chaos unfolded visibly to all present. It was clear this wasn't the apprehension of a felon. Rather, it appeared to be a grave mistake, all captured live on bystanders' videos. As Daniel was pinned down, the scene shifted drastically from an ordinary day at the airport to a spectacle of confusion and indignation. A crowd formed, their voices growing louder, their smartphones aloft, documenting the ordeal. "I'm not sure what you think I've done, but you are mistaken," Daniel insisted, his voice strained with frustration and fatigue. Pressed against the cold, polished floor, his glasses askew, his briefcase now open with its contents, a collection of human rights documents, UN reports, and legal briefs, strewn about, clearly depicted his true identity, far from the criminal Alex suspected. "Quiet!" Alex barked, tightening his grip on Daniel's wrist, adrenaline surging through him. Convinced he had captured a dangerous fugitive, his years of instinct assured him of his correctness. Ignoring the discontented murmurs of the crowd, Alex maintained his hold on Daniel, who continued to protest vehemently. "I am not who you think I am. I'm a lawyer, an international human rights lawyer. Check my identification. Call the Canadian consulate if necessary." His plea lingered in the tense airport atmosphere. However, Alex dismissed their pleas. A woman from the crowd advanced, her phone in hand. "Officer, I think you've made a mistake," she asserted, her voice both cautious and firm. "I've seen this man on television. He's a lawyer, not a criminal." Alex fixed her with a stern look. "Step back, ma'am. This is official business," he commanded, dismissing her. Yet her words sowed the seeds of doubt in his mind. He glanced at the scattered papers around Daniel, noticing a document with the United Nations emblem. For a moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Just then, an airport official arrived, accompanied by 2 security guards. "Sergeant Porter, what is happening here?" he demanded authoritatively. "This man is a fugitive," Alex responded shortly. "I recognized him from a bulletin and detained him." The official knelt beside Daniel, still on the ground. "Sir, can you confirm your identity?" he asked. Daniel, frustrated, replied sharply, "My name is Daniel Blake. I am a Canadian citizen and a human rights lawyer. You'll find my ID in my jacket pocket." This is all a big misunderstanding. A security officer retrieved Daniel's wallet and handed it to the official, who pulled out a Canadian passport and examined it. His frown deepened. "Sergeant, this is Daniel Blake. He is not the fugitive you thought he was." Alex's heart sank as realization dawned on him. His hold on Daniel relaxed as murmurs and gasps filled the air, the crowd's unrest growing louder. "Let him go!" someone yelled from the crowd. "This is absurd." Daniel stood up, massaging his wrists where Alex had held them tightly. Rachel, a colleague, pushed through the crowd, her face white with shock. She had been near the baggage claim when the commotion started and had recognized Daniel immediately. "Daniel!" she cried, rushing to his side. What on earth is happening? Shaking his head, a mix of anger and humiliation on his face, Daniel said, "Ask him," nodding towards Alex. Rachel confronted Alex, her tone biting and relentless. "You've just assaulted a human rights lawyer in front of dozens of witnesses. Do you realize who he is, or what you've just done?" Alex opened his mouth to reply but found himself speechless, frozen by the gravity of his error. Rachel didn't wait for his response. She turned to the airport official. "I want his badge number, and I want to speak with your supervisor. This is an unacceptable abuse of authority." The official responded with a grim nod. "Of course, ma'am. We will handle this." He then addressed Alex. "Sergeant, step aside. You've done enough." As the crowd slowly began to disperse, many continued to film Alex and Daniel, the scene still tense. Within minutes, videos of the incident were spreading online, with captions like "Human rights lawyer assaulted by airport cop," "Mistaken identity turns violent at Pearson Airport," and "Power trip or honest mistake." Daniel adjusted his glasses, his hands still shaking slightly from the ordeal. "This isn't over," he stated quietly, his voice steady yet filled with controlled anger. "Not by a long shot." As he and Rachel collected his scattered papers and belongings, Alex stood motionless, watching the man he had mistakenly detained walk away. For the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of his actions, a burden heavier than he could have ever imagined. The terminal remained abuzz with residual tension long after Daniel had left the scene. Yet, the repercussions were only beginning to unfold. Alex Porter stood frozen, his heart hammering and thoughts racing. He had relied on his instincts for years, but now they had betrayed him in a devastating and public manner. Meanwhile, Daniel was attempting to regain his composure as he and Rachel moved towards a quieter section of the airport. Rachel's presence offered a slight solace amid the turmoil. She had been at the baggage claim when the incident erupted, and her prompt action had shielded him from further disgrace. Nevertheless, the ordeal had left him deeply disturbed. "Are you all right?" Rachel inquired, her voice steady yet laden with concern. Daniel shook his head, the events still fresh. "In authoritarian states, I've been detained for defending human rights, Rachel. I've faced threats from corrupt officials. But to be assaulted at an airport in my own country—" He paused, rubbing his wrists. The faint red marks a stark reminder of the recent indignity. "This is ludicrous," he added. Rachel exhaled heavily. "It's completely unacceptable. We won't let this go. That officer had no business treating you like that." Daniel's initial shock was gradually replaced by a firm resolve. "This isn't just about me," he asserted. "What if I weren't a lawyer? What if I didn't know my rights? What if no one had stepped in?" His voice intensified, a mix of anger and concern evident. "How many others have suffered this humiliation without any support?" Back in a secluded office, Alex was facing his own crisis. Chief Security Officer Martin Hayes, displaying a blend of frustration and disappointment, closed the door behind them. "Alex, what on earth was that?" he demanded, his tone both low and stern. Alex collapsed into a chair, massaging his face. "I believed he was the fugitive." He fit the description and seemed anxious, avoiding eye contact. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he explained. Martin crossed his arms. "Being nervous isn't a crime, Alex. He's a human rights lawyer, not a fugitive. And you were filmed assaulting a Canadian citizen in broad daylight. It's already all over social media. This isn't going to just blow over." Alex raised his head, the gravity of his error weighing heavily. "I messed up, okay? I thought I had the right person. What do you want me to say?" "I want you to grasp the severity of your actions," Martin responded. "The department is being bombarded with calls. Journalists are asking for details, and the higher-ups want explanations. You need to address this before it gets completely out of hand." However, it was already too late for any containment. By the time Alex left the office, the incident had gone viral. News headlines screamed, "Airport cop assaults human rights lawyer in case of mistaken identity and profiling gone wrong. Viral airport incident sparks outrage." In a private lounge elsewhere in the airport, Daniel and Rachel were devising their next steps. "We need to file a formal complaint," Rachel stated firmly. "This can't be ignored." Daniel nodded, his face set in grim determination. "I agree," he said, ready to fight back against the injustice he had faced. But he was adamant that this went beyond a simple error. "This isn't merely a lapse in judgment. It reflects a broader systemic issue," Daniel argued, his voice laden with resolve. "How many more people has this officer mistreated like this? How many have endured similar abuse without the presence of cameras to reveal it?" Rachel paused, her expression troubled. "You're considering making this public, aren't you?" she questioned. "I don't see any other way," Daniel responded firmly. "If we don't bring this to light, it will just be another incident lost in bureaucracy. This is about more than holding one officer accountable. It's about addressing systemic issues like racial profiling, abuse of power, and inadequate oversight." That evening, Daniel issued a statement to the media outside the airport, with Rachel by his side. Addressing the assembled reporters, he spoke with composed intensity. "Today, I was a victim of clear power abuse," he began. "I was detained, assaulted, and humiliated publicly because an officer acted on mere instinct. This isn't just about defending my own rights. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen to anyone else. No one should endure such treatment, whether they are a lawyer, a traveler, or just someone going about their day." The statement quickly went viral, sparking debates on social media and various news platforms. While many lauded Daniel for his courage in speaking out, others scrutinized Alex's actions, accusing him of racial profiling and unnecessary aggression. For Alex, the consequences were immediate. He was called into a meeting with his superiors the following day, and informed he would be placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. "This is just temporary," Martin reassured him, though his tone was anything but comforting. "We need to show the public we're addressing this seriously." However, Alex understood the grim reality. His career was on the line. The instincts he had trusted for over 20 years had disastrously failed him, prompting a deep self-reckoning about his role and judgment. Later that evening, as Daniel entered his hotel room, the full impact of the day's events began to sink in. Overwhelmed and exhausted, he collapsed into a chair. Rachel was busy on her laptop, browsing through the flurry of social media reactions and news articles. "It's everywhere," she remarked, a mix of astonishment and indignation in her voice. She showed Daniel a video on her screen that had already gathered millions of views. It showed the whole ordeal, from Alex's aggressive approach to Daniel's composed protests and the distressing moment he was forced to the ground. Watching the footage, Daniel felt a surge of disbelief and frustration. "I never expected it to spread so quickly," he murmured. "It's not just the video," Rachel explained, her expression stern. "People are looking into your past, discovering your speeches, cases, and interviews. You're being portrayed as a hero standing up against power abuse." Daniel sighed, shaking his head. "I don't want to be a hero. I just want accountability. Officer Porter's actions weren't just a mistake. They were a flagrant disregard for my rights. And if he's done this to me, it's likely he's done it to others." Rachel nodded, her voice firm. "That's why we must act swiftly. This is bigger than just clearing your name. We need to expose the system that permitted this abuse. Meanwhile, Sergeant Alex Porter sat in his living room, watching the news coverage unfold on every major network. The incident was being analyzed repeatedly, with some commentators arguing that Alex had acted from genuine suspicion, while others demanded his immediate dismissal for bias. Beside him, his wife Linda expressed both concern and frustration. "Alex, you need to speak up," she urged, breaking the tense silence. "What am I supposed to say?" Alex retorted, his voice filled with despair. "That I tackled an innocent man based on a hunch? That I let my instincts overshadow basic protocol? Anything I say now could only make things worse." Linda sighed and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You made a mistake, Alex, and that's clear to everyone. But if you don't speak up, the media will shape the narrative for you." Alex shook his head, his mind swirling with regret. He knew he couldn't reverse what had happened, but the path forward seemed fraught with uncertainty and public scrutiny. But Alex wasn't ready to fully acknowledge, even to himself, that he was entirely to blame. Back at the hotel, Daniel's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. Journalists, activists, and colleagues were flooding him with messages, some offering support, others requesting interviews. However, one particular message stood out. It came from an anonymous user claiming to be a former officer from Alex's precinct. The message read, "This isn't the first time Porter has done something like this. Look into his disciplinary record. You'll find a pattern." Daniel immediately showed the message to Rachel, who didn't waste a second diving into research. Within minutes, she uncovered multiple reports of complaints against Alex. Allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and other misconduct littered his history. None of these had resulted in formal disciplinary action. "This is it," Rachel said, her eyes narrowing as she pieced the puzzle together. "This is where we need to focus. The system didn't just allow him to get away with it. It protected him. And it's not just him. This happens over and over again, to countless others." Daniel nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we need to expose that system, not just for me, but for everyone who's been subjected to this kind of abuse." The next morning, Daniel held a press conference outside his hotel. Rachel and several colleagues stood by his side as he faced a growing crowd of reporters and activists. Speaking with calm determination, he began, "What happened to me at the airport wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a much larger problem, a system that enables officers to act without accountability and shields them from consequences." Daniel then shared the details Rachel had uncovered about Alex's record. Sergeant Porter's actions weren't an exception. They were part of a pattern that this system has allowed to flourish. That is what needs to change. The press conference ignited a firestorm. Social media exploded with outrage, and hashtags like #JusticeForDaniel and #Reform the system trended worldwide. What had started as a personal ordeal at an airport had evolved into a global conversation about systemic abuses and police accountability. For Alex, the press conference was devastating. His superiors summoned him to an emergency meeting, where they delivered grim news. "We have no choice but to open a full investigation into your conduct," Chief Hayes informed him, his tone heavy. "This isn't just about you anymore, Alex. It's about the entire department. And the deeper they dig, the worse it's going to get." Suspended, under investigation, and facing mounting public scrutiny, Alex left the precinct that day feeling like his career was crumbling beneath him. 2 decades of service, built on his instincts and a commitment to protect the public, were now in jeopardy. As he stepped into the parking lot, the weight of his suspension sank in. Sitting in his car, Alex gripped the steering wheel with trembling hands. His badge and gun, once symbols of his identity and purpose, now sat in a sealed envelope on the passenger seat. Without them, Alex felt stripped of everything that had defined him, like a soldier dishonorably relieved of his rank. He stared out the windshield, his thoughts a storm of regret, disbelief, and frustration. The public he had sworn to protect now viewed him as a villain. The department, desperate to shield itself from the growing backlash, had distanced itself from him entirely. Alex considered calling Linda, but the words to explain how his life had unraveled refused to come. Meanwhile, Daniel was stepping into a new role, not just as a victim of abuse, but as a catalyst for change. What had begun as a humiliating encounter was rapidly transforming into a movement. With Rachel by his side, he resolved to push forward, determined to challenge the deeply entrenched system that had allowed this to happen. For Daniel, the fallout was far from over. It was just beginning. But Alex hesitated. What could he possibly say that Linda hadn't already heard? The sting of humiliation was still too sharp, too fresh. Instead of speaking, he simply turned the key in the ignition and drove home, the silence in the car weighing heavier than any words could. Meanwhile, Daniel Blake was seated in a conference room at his lawyer's office, surrounded by his legal team and Rachel. The air was thick with focus and determination. The airport incident had become the spark for something much larger than any of them had anticipated. What had begun as an act of personal mistreatment had now evolved into an investigation into systemic issues within law enforcement. "We have enough to file a civil suit," Rachel stated, her voice calm but resolute. "Not just against Alex Porter, but the department as well. We've uncovered at least 5 prior complaints of excessive force and profiling against Porter, all dismissed quietly, without any action." Daniel leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "What about the department itself? Are there patterns of similar behavior?" Rachel nodded, her expression grim. "Plenty. Their internal investigations are more about shielding officers than holding them accountable. It's the same story we see across the country: complaints swept under the rug, victims silenced, and misconduct rewarded with promotions or quiet transfers." Daniel exhaled deeply, frustration simmering beneath his composed demeanor. "Then that's where we focus. This isn't just about one officer. It's about tearing down the system that lets this happen in the first place." The team agreed, and within hours, a lawsuit was finalized and filed. The announcement reverberated across media outlets, sending shockwaves far and wide. Reporters and commentators delved into every detail, from Daniel's distinguished career as a human rights lawyer to Alex's troubled history as a police officer. The public response was divisive. Many hailed Daniel as a brave figure standing against systemic abuse, while others, particularly those aligned with law enforcement, defended Alex, claiming he had made a genuine mistake under immense pressure. However, the momentum was not on Alex's side. His name had become a symbol of police misconduct, and his face was now associated with systemic failures. The airport video, still widely circulated, was dissected by commentators. Analysts critiqued Alex's aggressive body language and praised Daniel's calm, non-escalatory demeanor. Every frame became a piece of evidence in the court of public opinion. At home, Alex sat on the couch, his eyes glued to the television as he flipped through channels, each one broadcasting the same story. Linda sat next to him, her face etched with concern. "You need to stay off social media," she said softly. "It's not helping." "I don't care about social media," Alex muttered, his voice heavy with frustration. "This is my life they're destroying, my career, my reputation. Do you have any idea how many people I've helped? How many times I've risked my life out there? And now none of it matters because of one mistake." Linda reached over, taking his hand gently. "It does matter, Alex," she said, her voice steady. But the look in Alex's eyes told her he wasn't convinced. To him, the weight of one mistake felt heavier than a lifetime of service. He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his frustration bubbling over. "I didn't do anything wrong," Alex exclaimed, his voice rising with each word. "I thought I was doing my job. How is that a crime?" Linda looked at him, her expression calm yet firm. "It's not about what you thought, Alex," she replied quietly, but her words carried weight. "It's about what happened. The more you deny it, the harder this will be for everyone." Her honesty stung, leaving Alex unable to form a rebuttal. He felt trapped, the walls of his world seemingly closing in, and for the first time in his life, he was at a complete loss on how to fight back. Across town, Daniel was dealing with an entirely different kind of pressure. His phone never stopped buzzing. Calls from journalists, activists, and supporters poured in, while his inbox overflowed with messages ranging from heartfelt encouragement to hateful vitriol. The relentless spotlight was beginning to take a toll on him, but Daniel remained focused on the greater purpose. "We need to maintain the pressure," he told Rachel during a late-night strategy session. His voice was calm but resolute. "This isn't just about winning a lawsuit. It's about pushing for real change in the department and the system." Rachel nodded, her expression equally determined. "The public's eyes are on us right now. We have to make every moment count. The more they learn about Porter's history and the department's failures, the harder it'll be for anyone to sweep this under the rug." As days passed, the case gathered even more traction. Protests began outside the airport, with demonstrators waving signs that read "Justice for Daniel" and "End Police Abuse." Civil rights organizations joined the fray, amplifying the incident as a rallying cry for broader reforms within law enforcement. For Alex, the growing outcry was deafening. Every news report, every protest chant, and every online comment felt like another nail in the coffin of his career. He spent most of his days holed up at home, avoiding the outside world entirely. Even his closest friends and colleagues seemed to distance themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations by supporting him publicly. Despite the isolation, Alex couldn't shake the feeling that he was being unfairly scapegoated. In his mind, he wasn't the villain the media had painted him to be. He was just a man who had made a bad call under challenging circumstances. Yet, as the investigation into his actions deepened, Alex was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. His mistakes were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger, undeniable pattern, and no amount of denial could change that. The suspension, which he had initially viewed as a temporary inconvenience, now felt like permanent exile. For the first time in his career, Alex Porter began to wrestle with a question he had never dared to ask. Had he been part of the problem all along? Sitting in a sterile, windowless internal affairs office, Alex found himself face-to-face with Detective Sandra Diaz. The room was devoid of personality, illuminated by faintly humming fluorescent lights. Across from him, Diaz, a meticulous investigator known for her thoroughness, had a thick, worn file folder labeled with Alex's name resting in front of her. "Sergeant Porter," Diaz began, her tone calm but firm. "I trust you understand the severity of the situation you're in. Your actions at Pearson International Airport have sparked a media firestorm and brought intense scrutiny to this department. What we need to establish now is whether this incident was a singular lapse in judgment or part of a more troubling pattern." Alex shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his jaw clenched tightly. "I've served this department for over 20 years, he began, his voice carrying a mix of defensiveness and weariness. "I've risked my life countless times for the public. That day at the airport, I made a decision based on the information I had and my instincts." He hesitated, his voice faltering slightly. "Was it the right call? Clearly not. But you have to understand, this isn't just going to blow over." Chris paused, his voice heavy with concern. "The department is under a microscope, and your name is at the center of it." Alex leaned back in his chair, his expression a mix of anger and exhaustion. "I wasn't acting out of malice, Chris," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "I thought I was doing my job. How did it get to this?" Chris sighed, glancing around the dimly lit room. "I know you believe that, but this isn't just about what you think, Alex. It's about perception, how the public sees it, how the department is handling it, and, honestly, how the evidence stacks up." Across the city, Daniel Blake was immersed in preparation with his legal team. In the conference room, papers and evidence covered the table as Rachel tapped a thick stack of documents. "This file is damning," she stated. "Porter's record shows a consistent pattern of misconduct, excessive force, racial profiling, and unprofessional behavior. And every single complaint was dismissed without investigation. That strengthens our case. This isn't just negligence, it's systemic complicity." Daniel nodded, his face set with determination. "The public needs to understand that this goes beyond Porter. This is about a culture that protects its own instead of serving the community." Rachel leaned back, her tone sharp with focus. "The media is already on our side. Civil rights organizations are rallying behind this case. If we win, and I'm confident we will, it will send a clear message. Departments across the country can't operate like this anymore." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, the weight of responsibility evident in his posture. "This can't just be about punishment," he said quietly. "It has to be about real change. If all we do is take Porter down, the system will just create more like him." Rachel met his gaze and nodded. "That's why the lawsuit isn't just targeting him. We're going after the department's policies, their lack of oversight, and their failure to hold officers accountable. We're addressing the root of the problem." Back at the precinct, the atmosphere among Alex's former colleagues was tense. Conversations about the incident were avoided in public, but whispers filled the locker rooms and hallways. Some officers defended Alex, blaming the media for exaggerating the situation. Others viewed his actions as a stain on the department's reputation. That evening, Detective Chris Manning, one of Alex's closest friends on the force, stopped by Alex's house. Sitting in the dimly lit living room, Chris struggled to find the right words. "Look, Alex, I know this is hitting you hard," he began, his tone cautious. "But you have to face the fact that this isn't going to go away. The department, the public, they're looking for answers. You're the focus." Alex's frustration boiled over. "I've given this department everything," he snapped. 2 decades of service, putting my life on the line. Now, one mistake, one decision, and I'm the villain." Chris shifted uncomfortably, choosing his words carefully. "I get it, Alex. But this isn't just about you. It's bigger than that. You need to decide how you're going to handle it, because sitting here, doing nothing, won't fix it." Alex stared at the floor, the reality of Chris's words settling in. He felt the weight of his mistakes, the scrutiny of the public, and the betrayal of a system he'd once trusted to have his back. "Maybe it's time to stop focusing on how people see you and start thinking about why they see you that way," Chris said, his voice calm but firm. "I know you, Alex. I've worked alongside you for years. You've always been one of the good ones, but being good doesn't mean being perfect. You've got to ask yourself, did you really handle that situation at the airport the best way you could have?" Alex stared at the floor, his shoulders heavy with doubt. "I thought I was protecting people," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "I thought I was doing my job." "But were you protecting people?" Chris pressed. "Or were you just acting on instincts that might not always be right? You've got to face it, Alex. Maybe it's not just you. Maybe it's the system we're part of that's broken." For the first time, Alex didn't have a quick answer. He looked up, his eyes tired and filled with uncertainty. The words hung in the air, impossible to dismiss. The investigation into his actions wasn't just revealing the cracks in his own judgment. It was peeling back layers of a system that had shielded officers like him for decades. Every dismissed complaint, every failure to hold someone accountable, it was all part of a larger, damning pattern. Across town, Daniel Blake was stepping onto a small platform surrounded by cameras and protesters outside Pearson International Airport. The crowd had swelled, their signs demanding justice for Daniel and police accountability. Now, people of all backgrounds stood united, their chants echoing through the terminal. Daniel had been hesitant to attend the protest, not wanting to overshadow the broader cause. But Rachel had insisted. "Your presence matters," she told him. "People aren't just here for you. They're here because your story revealed something bigger. You're a symbol now, whether you want to be or not." As Daniel stepped up to the podium, cheers erupted from the crowd. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, his demeanor calm and resolute. When the noise subsided, he took a deep breath, his voice steady yet charged with emotion. "What happened to me at this airport wasn't just a mistake," he began, each word deliberate. "It was a reflection of a system that prioritizes power over accountability, instinct over reason, and silence over transparency. And I'm not alone. For every person like me, someone with the privilege and platform to fight back, there are countless others who didn't have that chance. People whose stories were buried, whose complaints were ignored, and whose lives were turned upside down without recourse." The crowd erupted into applause, their chants of justice filling the air. Daniel continued, his voice rising with conviction. "This isn't about one officer or one department. It's about a culture that allows this to happen. It's about demanding better from those sworn to protect us. And it's about ensuring no one else has to endure what I did, or what so many others have endured." Meanwhile, Alex Porter sat in his living room, the protest coverage playing on the television. Watching Daniel address the crowd sent a wave of mixed emotions through him: anger, shame, and a deep pang of regret. Every headline reduced his decades of service to a single moment of failure. The narrative was clear: Alex, the reckless, aggressive cop; Daniel, the courageous, eloquent victim. The doorbell rang, breaking Alex's spiral of thoughts. He opened it to find Chris standing on the porch, holding 2 cups of coffee. "Figured you could use some company," Chris said, stepping inside. They sat together in silence for a moment, the television still playing in the background. Chris handed Alex a coffee and gestured toward the screen. "That's a big crowd," he remarked. Alex nodded, staring into his cup. "He's good at this," he muttered. "He knows exactly how to make me look like the villain." Chris raised an eyebrow. "You sure he's making you look like anything? Or are people just seeing the truth?" The question hit Alex harder than he expected. He set the coffee down and leaned back, rubbing his face. "I don't know any more, Chris. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now it feels like everything I've ever done is being questioned." Chris leaned forward, his tone soft but firm. "Maybe it's not about being right or wrong. Maybe it's about figuring out what you can do now. You can't change what happened, Alex. But you can decide what kind of person you want to be going forward." "But firm, maybe it's time to start asking those questions yourself, Alex," Chris said, locking eyes with his friend. "This isn't just about what happened at the airport. It's about the system that allows people like us to operate without enough oversight. You've seen it, same as me. Complaints that vanish, actions brushed aside, promotions handed out too easily. Maybe this is a wake-up call." Alex looked up, a flicker of doubt flashing across his face. "You think I'm part of the problem?" Chris paused for a moment, his tone steady. "I think we all are. but it's not too late to start fixing it. Back at the protest, Rachel pulled Daniel aside after his speech, her tone urgent but supportive. "That was powerful," she said. "But we need to talk about the next steps. The media is devouring this story, and we've got a real chance to make something happen." Daniel nodded, his face serious. "The lawsuit is moving forward, but that's not enough. We need to push for systemic reforms, policy changes, independent oversight, something that reaches beyond this case." Rachel agreed instantly. "I've already been in touch with a few civil rights organizations. They want to partner with us and turn this into a national movement. Police reform bills are already being debated in Parliament, and your case could be the spark that gets them passed." The thought both exhilarated and overwhelmed Daniel. He hadn't asked to become the face of a movement, but the responsibility was undeniable. Taking a deep breath, he nodded. "If this can bring real change, then let's do it." As the protest wound down that evening, its impact rippled far and wide. Social media lit up with photos, videos, and hashtags amplifying the cause. News anchors debated the significance of the event, pointing to Daniel's speech as a turning point. For Daniel, the day felt like validation, a sign that his ordeal could transform into meaningful progress. For Alex, however, it was a brutal reminder of how far he had fallen. Sitting alone in his living room, he watched the protest coverage on TV late into the night. One thought repeated in his mind. Was Chris right? Have I been blind to the flaws in the system I served? The reckoning was no longer just public. It was deeply personal. For both men, the fight for justice and accountability was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers as spectators filed into their seats. Journalists, activists, and members of the public packed the room, eager to witness the trial that had captured the nation's attention. The tension in the air was palpable. This was no ordinary legal battle. It was a symbolic clash over accountability, systemic reform, and the culture of modern law enforcement. Daniel sat at the plaintiff's table, his posture composed and deliberate. Dressed in a tailored suit, he radiated professionalism and determination. Beside him, Rachel scribbled notes on a legal pad, her focus razor-sharp. Across the aisle, Alex sat with his lawyer. His face was pale, drawn, and weighed down by the relentless scrutiny of the public and his own doubts. He avoided looking at Daniel, keeping his gaze fixed on the table before him. When the judge entered, the courtroom fell silent. After the formalities, Rachel stood to deliver the opening statement. Her tone was calm yet commanding. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice ringing with conviction, "this case is not just about the actions of one man. It is about a system that has allowed those actions to go unchecked for years. My client, Daniel Blake, is a respected human rights lawyer, a man who has dedicated his life to justice and fairness. On the day in question, he was wrongfully detained, assaulted, and humiliated in front of dozens of witnesses, all because of a hasty and unfounded assumption." Rachel let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "But this case isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior, a pattern that exposes the systemic flaws within law enforcement, flaws that have gone unaddressed for far too long." As the courtroom emptied after the session, Alex's lawyer leaned in and spoke in a low voice. "We can appeal," he said, his tone cautious but not optimistic. Alex nodded silently, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The weight of the trial, the evidence against him, and the growing realization of his own complicity pressed down like a heavy burden. For the first time, he truly began to question not just the system he had served, but the role he had played within it. But as a catalyst for change. Daniel understood that the verdict, while monumental, was only the first step in a much larger battle. Sitting in his hotel room late at night, the weight of the moment bore down on him. The case wasn't just about him anymore. It had become a rallying cry for those seeking accountability and reform in law enforcement. Rachel joined him, handing over a glass of wine. "You should take a moment to celebrate," she said with a soft smile. "You've earned it." Daniel nodded, raising the glass but only taking a small sip. "I'll celebrate when we see real change," he replied. This case was just the beginning. There are policies to rewrite, systems to dismantle, and voices that still need to be heard. Meanwhile, Alex Porter sat alone in his dimly lit house, the silence almost deafening. The trial had ended, but its impact lingered like a storm that had yet to pass. Linda had left earlier in the day, unable to face the reporters stationed outside. Alex hadn't touched the dinner she'd left for him. Instead, he sat in the dark, scrolling through headlines that painted him as a symbol of systemic failure. Officer found liable in landmark case. Blake's victory fuels calls for reform, and asterisk, a reckoning for law enforcement. Asterisk. He clicked on a video of Daniel's press conference and watched in silence. Daniel's calm, deliberate words echoed in his mind. Asterisk, this is about a system that has allowed abuses of power to go unchecked for far too long. We cannot stop here. Asterisk, for the first time, Alex felt a twinge of understanding, not just about Daniel's perspective, but about his own failings. He thought back to the complaints Detective Diaz had read during the trial, each one a wound he had caused but dismissed as an overreaction or a misunderstanding. Stripped of his badge and authority, Alex was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth. His actions had been part of a pattern, one enabled by a system he had trusted and defended. Alex stared at his phone, the weight of the past weeks pressing down on him. 4 years, he'd believed his instincts and intentions were enough, but the trial had exposed the flaws in that belief. The world was changing, and he was left to grapple with his place in it. Was there a way to reconcile with the truth and make amends, or was it too late? The aftermath of the trial rippled far beyond the courthouse walls. Daniel's victory was hailed as a watershed moment in the fight against police misconduct. News outlets called it a landmark case. Activists celebrated it as proof that accountability was possible, and social media buzzed with discussions about reform. Hashtags like #JusticeForDaniel and #PoliceReform now continued to trend, amplifying the case's significance. But for both men, the end of the trial marked the beginning of new and very different journeys. For Daniel, the days following the verdict were a whirlwind of interviews, strategy sessions, and advocacy meetings. His inbox overflowed with messages, some from supporters, others from strangers sharing their own harrowing stories of injustice. Every email and call was a reminder of the responsibility he now bore. Daniel wasn't just a victim anymore. He had become a symbol of hope and change. For Alex, the days were filled with silence and reflection. The public humiliation and loss of his career weighed heavily on him, but so did the realization that his actions had contributed to the systemic failures he once ignored. He knew there was no undoing what had happened, but perhaps there was a way to move forward, to acknowledge his part in the problem and begin to make amends. As the city continued to buzz with the fallout of the verdict, both men prepared for what lay ahead. Daniel, vindicated but driven, resolved to fight for reform and justice, knowing the road would be long and fraught with challenges. Alex, humbled and lost, began to face the consequences of his actions and grapple with the truth of his own complicity. For both, the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. As a leader in the fight to dismantle systemic abuse, Daniel found himself navigating a new and challenging role. Rachel, ever pragmatic, pushed him to capitalize on the momentum. "This is your moment, Daniel," she said one morning as they prepared for another press conference. "People are listening. We have a real chance to push for meaningful reforms. Daniel nodded, his mind racing with possibilities. While the lawsuit had been a personal victory, he knew it wasn't enough. We need to create something lasting, he said. A platform for real change, policies, oversight, education, something that goes beyond the headlines. Within weeks, Daniel announced the launch of a non-profit organization, Accountability Now, funded in part by the damages he had been awarded. Its mission was clear: to support victims of police misconduct, advocate for policy reforms, and provide resources to communities disproportionately affected by systemic abuse. At the non-profit's launch event, Daniel addressed a crowd of supporters and reporters. His voice carried the same calm resolve that had defined him throughout the trial. "This isn't about vengeance," he said. "It's about justice. It's about ensuring that what happened to me, and to countless others, stops happening. It's about creating a system where trust is earned, not demanded, and where those in power are held accountable for their actions." The organization quickly gained traction. Civil rights groups partnered with Accountability Now, and public figures lent their support. Daniel stepped into a new role, not just as a lawyer, but as an advocate and a symbol of hope for those who had long felt powerless. Despite his newfound success, Daniel remained grounded. He often reflected on the trial and Alex Porter, the man at the center of it, with him. He didn't harbor hatred for Alex. Instead, he hoped Alex would find a way to confront the same system that had shaped him. For Alex, life after the trial was starkly different. Suspended from the force and shunned by the public, he retreated into solitude. The badge that had once defined him now felt like a relic of another life, and his identity as a protector seemed to have been stripped away. In the quiet of his home, Alex began to face the truths he had avoided for so long. The trial had forced him to confront his role in perpetuating a broken system. Complaints he had once dismissed as misunderstandings or overreactions now appeared in a different light, excuses that had shielded him from accountability. One evening, Chris Manning visited, bringing a six-pack of beer and an unflinching question. "So, what's next?" Chris asked, handing Alex a cold can. Alex shrugged, staring at the unopened beer in his hands. "I don't know, Chris. I spent my whole life thinking I was one of the good guys. Now, I'm not so sure." Chris leaned back, his tone thoughtful but firm. "Maybe it's time to stop thinking in terms of good guys and bad guys. Maybe it's time to figure out how to fix what's broken." The conversation stayed with Alex. Over the following weeks, he began reading articles and books about systemic reform, delving into the history and structure of the law enforcement system he had once defended without question. The more he learned, the more he recognized how deeply entrenched the problems were, and how much he had overlooked. One day, Alex took a deep breath and wrote an email to Daniel Blake. In it, he apologized, not just for the airport incident, but for his role in a system that allowed such incidents to happen. "I can't undo what I've done," he wrote, "but I want to learn how to be part of the solution, not the problem." To his surprise, Daniel replied. The response was measured but encouraging. Daniel acknowledged Alex's apology and invited him to a meeting with activists and reform advocates working with Accountability Now. For Alex, it felt like the first step on a long road toward redemption. The trial's ripple effects continued to spread. Public pressure led to significant changes within Alex's former department, including the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review complaints against officers. Other departments across the country began implementing similar reforms, seeking to avoid their own public reckonings. Legislation inspired by Daniel's case gained traction, pushing for greater transparency and accountability in law enforcement. Months later, Daniel and Alex met face-to-face for the first time since the trial. The setting was unassuming, a community center surrounded by activists and reform advocates. Alex felt out of place at first, but Daniel greeted him with a handshake and a simple question. Ready to listen? The meeting wasn't about absolution or erasing the past. It was about moving forward, about finding ways to dismantle the structures that enabled abuse and building something better in their place. As they sat together in that room, two men once on opposite sides of a courtroom, now sitting side by side, it became clear that change wasn't just possible, it was already happening. For Daniel, the journey was far from over, but he had found his purpose. For Alex, the path to redemption was just beginning, and for the world watching their story, it was a reminder that even in the face of deep divisions, progress was possible when people were willing to confront the truth and fight for something better.